Tom is an Army officer and was originally commissioned after he graduated from Boston University in the military intelligence branch. He later went to Georgetown, where en route to coming back to teach in the Department of Social Sciences at the Military Academy at West Point. After that, he served in a variety of assignments, including being in the War Plans Division in the Pentagon at the time that people were deploying over to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And then he moved from there, from the Army staff, up to the Office of the Secretary of Defense's staff, where he was working in the shop for Secretary Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, doing a lot of the planning and defense strategy, actually working for a classmate of mine from here, Mr. Barry Pavel, who was the Director of Defense Strategy in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And so Tom continued in that, and at that point, it was time for him to rotate. He became the chief planner for the Multinational Security and Transition Command in Iraq, working for General Marty Dempsey, deployed to Iraq for a year. And as we've talked about in my class, and most of my students are here, building in professional military education is critical for military officers throughout their career. And so at this point, with about 20 years in the Army, it was time for Colonel Cosentino to go to the War College. And so in lieu of going to the War College of Carlisle or at National Defense University, they decided to send him as a fellow to the United States Institute of Peace for 1 year, and that's where he's working right now. When he's done with this job, he will go back into a very senior policy job, again back in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy office, working now for Ambassador Eric Edelman, who is now the Chief of Policy in the Pentagon. So I think with his background, and I asked him particularly to talk about the kinds of things that happened in Iraq while he was there, the military force planning, decision making, and those kinds of issues, and especially leave plenty of time for questions. So without any further ado, let me give you Colonel Tom Cosentino.
Thanks, I appreciate it. What I'd like to do is try to put what the MNSTCI, the Multinational Security and Transition Command, what it's all about, what its mission was, in the context of something that we really, at least in my time as an Army officer, had really not given I think the thought to how do we stand up a government that we brought down, and specifically, how do we deal with the issue of security in there. And I'll talk a little bit as we go along about some of the assumptions that we made that proved wrong at various stages that really drive us to where we're at today in this mission to stand up Iraqi security forces. And one of the things I'd also like to do is try to, while this is Mike asked me to, kind of give the brief that we gave Congress last summer on where the MNSTCI, the Transition Command mission, where we were at that point, and then talk a little bit about, where are we a year later? So this is basically the brief that my boss had to give to the House Armed Services Committee, and which I had to talk through in much more painful detail with the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, because they had a lot of questions, because it's your money that we're spending in Iraq. So I'm going to go into that a little bit, but try to put it into a broader U.S., kind of what have I learned individually, and what do I think as a government we're wrestling with now that comes out of this particular piece of the mission. One thing, I know we got a broad community of folks here, but for the actual students of Mike Meese, what I'd like to find out is how many of you are thinking about going into government afterwards? Okay. Now, just how many on the defense side? Anybody? Okay, so one or two, and I know there's a couple of future military officers there. How about state or USAID? How about non-governmental organizations? Okay. Well, I will tell you that, practically speaking, to have a to do this mission here successfully, this is not just a Department of Defense mission. And I will tell you that there's pieces of it that we are doing that should not be. That's my opinion, but I think it's a broadly held opinion. There are pieces of it that probably should not be our mission, but we're doing it because there was nobody else prepared or able to do it. So when you think about why is this so hard to do, there's a lot of reasons, but a part of it is that we really didn't think it through, and we weren't really prepared as a U.S. government to do this type of thing. Now we're moving, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing to make a difference. And in Q&A, when they shut off the recorder, I could talk a little bit more actually.
I'll advance this.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is a typical little military briefing. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about Minsticky, the campaign plan. What did we look for in 2007 and 2008 and beyond, and then some of the issues. Thanks. Okay, well, this is a really different animal, Minsticky, because one of the things is that it is, in fact, a multinational organization. While the majority of the people in this organization are Americans, we've got quite a few British, Australian, Poles, and a whole bunch of Bulgarians, Macedonians. They go on and on. And what I'll tell you is, unlike some of the combat missions where we've had a challenge, being multinational, because of country caveats where certain countries aren't able to, but for legislative reasons, aren't able to put their forces into particular types of combat or types of patrolling, and we're finding that not just in Iraq but in Afghanistan. In this particular mission, training security forces, I think that the multinational piece of this has been pretty successful because, especially our European partners, what they bring to the table is a perspective on certain skill sets, specifically training police and border security and some of those other skill sets that we're not really very experienced in the military. So in the U.S. military. So just running through it, we have a staff. I'll come back here in a second. And then below that, we had a team that was devoted towards ministerial capacity building. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. For the Ministry of Defense, we had a joint headquarters transition team, which was focused on training the joint staff. And I think you've given them some reference on how the U.S. government's military structure works. Well, the Iraqis have a joint staff also, but it's a new animal that we kind of shoved on. They didn't operate in this way, and but what we found is they've taken to it actually fairly well. And then a coalition military assistance training team, and unlike the famous MIT teams that you hear about out there, the guys who are actually out patrolling with units, what these people are is they run the basic training and the institutional base for the forces. So, like at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, we put people through basic training. We have facilities that in Iraq that do the same thing, and that's what those trainers do. Now, what's really interesting about this is that their primary mission is not to train Iraqi soldiers to be soldiers. Their primary mission is to train Iraqis to train Iraqi soldiers. And this was a fundamental challenge that we had, and that we had some struggles with initially, was figuring out, do we just pump people out onto the street, or do we build a self-sufficient government in Iraq? And the same thing with the civilian police and assistant training teams. The difference with those there is we not only run a Ministry of Interior transition team and run the actual schoolhouse. This is an area where we manage what's in effect about a $600 million contract to bring international policemen from all over the world to work daily with Iraqis. And then an intelligence transition team, an Air Force. Believe it or not, the Iraqis are sovereign states, so they want an Air Force. And this becomes, again, I'll talk a little bit more about the challenges of working with a sovereign government on what we think we should pay for them to have and what they think they should have. A National Counter-Terror Transition Team and a Ministry of Interior Transition Team. Now, this animal over here is, I think, in the long run, has the potential to be a big player in the future of the supporting mission in Iraq, and that's the NATO training mission in Iraq. The Minsticky commander is currently dual-hatted as both the U.S. Commander that's responsible for this mission, but also for the NATO training mission, which is largely there to train the officers of the Iraqi army. And that is, in fact, a NATO organization and different than everything else there. So that's just the background. I'm going to move through these slides kind of quickly so that we can kind of talk about the meat of this. All right, so especially for the students, when you plan this, you learned about lines of operation in conventional warfare. Well, one of the things we figured out here pretty quickly is that, guess what? A plan is a plan. And the most effective way to plan is to organize your way into the future the same way that you would organize a conventional plan, but different. So we had lines of operation, but they're not all parallel in their pace or timing. So for this particular mission, it was build and sustain a Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense, generate an army, develop a professional army, and then, and this is the unique thing about Minsticky, it's the only command in Iraq that has transition in its title. Mm-hmm. And our mission is basically to work ourselves out of a job so that we can leave and that the Iraqis can take over. And then has a mission to actually transform ourselves into something else, which I'll talk about. Okay, this is kind of an eye chart from way back there. But what it tells you is that really that we're not just doing this 6 months at a time. And that has probably been a legitimate criticism of how we've approached some of the planning in Iraq, is that we did this, it was always like 6 months and then we'll be leaving, so it was a very short-term view of everything. But this particular plan recognizes that while the combat mission may change drastically because of the situation on the ground or because of political imperatives either in the U.S. or in Iraq, we had to think deep on this training mission, because you cannot build a defense department or an interior department and the capacity to secure a country in a year. And I think maybe from a public relations standpoint, that might have been one of our bigger failures in not clearly differentiating between this mission, which is a capacity building mission, and the warfighting. So this is actually, this mission, when we think about it, and we think about what the Iraqis have to do to make themselves capable, we go out all the way to 2015 and beyond. Hey, go ahead. All right, those are the 4 lines of operation. Go to the next one. So our biggest challenge in Iraq, our most important challenge for the command I was in, especially through 2006 and 2007, was how to make the two ministries capable to stand on their own. Because we can train soldiers, and we can train policemen, but if the organizations that support them and provide everything from their food to their fuel to their pay, that interacts with the rest of the Iraqi government, that represents as the face of defense to the people of Iraq, if they're not capable, then what you're building is something that's going to collapse. You have to have a sound infrastructure. So in 2007, these are some of the areas that we looked at. We recognized that there were a couple of different missions inside Iraq that these ministries had to be able to do. One of them was to continue a fight against terrorists. But the other was to look deep and say, how do we transition to a more normal defense posture, where we're not fighting people in the streets of Iraq, but we're preparing to defend Iraq and stand up over time. So these were some of the areas that we looked at, and this is a big one here: foreign military sales. One of the biggest problems in Iraq, inside its ministries, has been corruption, and it's a legacy of Saddam Hussein. When Saddam wanted helicopters, he called up his chief of acquisitions. He made sure the family was secure so they couldn't slip out of the country. He handed the guy $300 or $400 million in suitcase or line of credit in a Swiss bank, and he put him on an airplane. And he said, "Go buy helicopters." And when they broke down, sent him out to buy more helicopters. So the idea of actually, building a system that could sustain the military, maintain the equipment they have, so that you could spend money on other things like developing civilian infrastructure, developing the economy, doing all those things. He just didn't do that, and that wasn't his primary concern. Well, the problem with that is that's what the Iraqis knew. That's how they understood how to do business. So transitioning them into a system that is corrupt at its core, and that made sense and was functioning for acquisitions and other areas, is probably one of the biggest challenges that the government of Iraq has. Next one. Okay. While this is all going on, while we're working with these ministries, we're out there pumping soldiers out. And one of the challenges here is this is like building an airplane in flight. And I had a great congressman, Marty Meehan, ask me, "Well, you said you were going to do this on this date, and then 6 months later you hadn't done that. You did something else, and we gave you the money to do this thing. We're fighting." So we, at one point, 6 months ago, I told you we were going to have a logistics system in place. We were going to build a depot. We were going to train logisticians. And we were going to buy parts, and we were going to put them in place. Why didn't we do that? Well, a lot of reasons we didn't do that. The Iraqi forces were in combat on a day-to-day basis. Attrition was high. They were losing people. The commanders grabbed the logisticians we had trained, and they turned them into riflemen, and then we didn't have any logisticians. So we had to go back to the schoolhouse. So these are some of the challenges that you have when you're building an army and building an institution to support the army, and you're doing it while you're in the middle of a war. It's a highly complicated situation, and when one thing goes off track, it's like throwing a pebble in a pond. And while you can keep moving in the general direction, if you think you're going to have peacetime metrics for a wartime situation, it just doesn't work that way. Next slide. Let me ask a question. What do you, for any of the students or anybody in the audience, what do you think that when we look at trying to build this army in Iraq and build this police force in Iraq, what do you think our number one challenge is as we try to do it? Somebody give me personnel.
Sunni Shia?
No, not Sunni Shia. That is a challenge, but you're on the right track. Personnel. Tell me about personnel. What's the number one challenge with personnel?
Find people who are willing to work as a police officer. Since
Well, that is a challenge, but it's not the number one challenge. That is a big challenge. What do you think the number one challenge is? What do we say every day when we pick up the paper that America is falling behind the rest of the world on? And that if we don't... Huh? Education. The number one challenge in building a capable force in Iraq is literacy. It's literacy. They can't read. Ha! What a surprise that was for us. When we went in there, I mean, we were dumbfounded. Why? Because we had a snapshot, an assumption in our mind of Iraq of 1990 and 1991. We never really thought through the effect of 12 years of sanctions on Iraq, of people not able to leave the country to go to school, of the of Saddam Hussein just being a paranoid guy who was always looking for competing power centers and keeping an eye on teachers and professors at universities and so on. The bottom line is a large part of the Iraqi population had become functionally illiterate. And that is a real challenge when you're trying to build a military and a police force that can stand on its own. Because if you can't read, if you can't write, you can't be a leader for the first thing. You can't be a leader. You can't run and manage a maintenance system. You can't develop a budget. You can't do a whole series of things. This is a challenge, and in a couple of minutes when I talk about why capacity building in this area takes more than just the Defense Department. It takes the State Department, it takes USAID, it takes non-governmental organizations. That's our number one challenge right now in standing up a effective force in Iraq. Go ahead. And then finally, transition. Well, I mean, what did we envision we would get to in Iraq for this particular headquarters? Historically, and some folks in here may know this, and you guys are voting knows it, but historically, the Defense Department has not had this mission to train foreign militaries or police, for that matter, and the whole mission of security cooperation. That has largely been a State Department mission with DoD support. So when we look out, we envision at some point having an Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq and a normalized relationship with Iraq. And one of the misconceptions, I think, personally, about the talk about a long-term relationship with Iraq is this idea that people are looking for bases for 50 years in Iraq or whatever. I think that one of the big things that we're trying to do is figure out how do we get Iraq on track to go to a more normalized relationship, similar to what we have with other countries. But, okay, so and now this is about a year and a half ago. But back when I got to Iraq in 2006, this was really the state of the security ministries. They weren't self-reliant in anything that they did. They just couldn't do it. And it was everything from processes to actual execution. So, but they had by that point, General Petraeus had stood up multinational security Security Transition Command in '04, and he had been able to get some of these areas as shared responsibility. Go ahead. By 2007, really, as the surge started, we were in this area with equipping, maintaining, contracting, and communications largely being done by the coalition. Why is that important? Well, I'll tell you, our goal. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead. Our goal was to kind of continue sliding to the right. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't want to speak for the commander of Minsticky, but I would argue that a couple of areas, specifically contracting and budget execution, we're still, well, budget execution has probably moved to shared responsibility. Contracting still has a ways to go, and possibly you can make an argument that equipping is somewhere stalled in between those two areas. Largely because we had to make a choice in 2007 between lowering the level of violence in Iraq or pushing Iraq to a more self-reliant standard. And the decision was made that the first focus would be on lowering the level of violence. And probably, legitimate question, again, good question that I got from the House Oversight and Investigation. Why is this taking so long? We made some mistakes on our assumptions. After the elections of 2005, we really anticipated when we, you don't draw up, especially for the students here, it's not like magic. You draw up a budget, and then you have to execute the budget, and there are people all through this process. Some of them more competent than others, both in Iraq and in the bureaucracy of the U.S. and in the industrial base of the U.S. So some things happen faster than others. But really, fundamentally, the biggest problem we had was we got the assumption wrong on a diminishing level of violence. When we laid out a budget that looked out over 2 or 3 years, we really anticipated that by 2006, after the elections, that we would have gone past a tipping point in violence, and that the Iraqis would be getting more traction on building their capability across the government. Now, I'm going to come to, especially in Q&A, I would say that this is not just an issue for the Defense Department, but it's an issue for the U.S. government that it needs to think about when working with foreign partners. Because we really don't have the capacity right now as a government to help a country across all of its needs, not just military, but economic and governmental, and all those pieces fit together. But getting that wrong, and the Samara Mosque bombing in early 2006 pushed us back on this particular mission to build the Iraqi security forces. I would say that we've picked up traction in the last few months, and we could, again, in Q&A we can debate that a little bit, but and we could talk about it. So what were we hoping to finish up by 2007? Completing unit training and fielding of Iraqi security forces, improving soldiers' lethality, training and developing leaders, developing and mentoring National Security Command and control structures, and developing Iraqi logistical self-sufficiency, and then transitioning responsibilities to the government of Iraq. That was our plan. A couple of those things we haven't been able to achieve. Mike, why don't we jump through this and go to the... Okay, go back to that one for a second. Wow, this is somewhat of an eye chart. But why this is important to understand is there's a perception that we're spending billions of dollars in Iraq and nothing is happening. I would tell you that we're spending billions of dollars in Iraq largely on ourselves. Largely on ourselves. It's for U.S. military operations. As far as building the capacity of, in this particular area, of the Iraqi military, we've already reached a tipping point where the Iraqis are spending much more money on themselves than we are. To the tune of, I think this year, it'll be about 5 to 1. So we're spending a lot of money in Iraq, but it's on U.S. operations. I think that's a good news story, and I'll tell you why. Because we've started this transition to where they're spending more money on themselves, and where they're even spending their money inside U.S. acquisition systems through foreign military sales. And a light bulb went on in 2007 with the Iraqis. And I think the light bulb was that regardless of what happens, the U.S. is not going to stay in Iraq in the same manner it's there now forever. There's going to be a change. So they've been spending a lot of their own money on building up their capabilities. Why is that important? Because as we transition the operational mission, the warfight, we're not going to have to go through a real traumatic transition on building the forces of Iraq. They're already spending most of their money. Excellent. Okay, so when you do this mission, though, there's a balance: assimilation and dependency. And I will tell you, we pushed the Iraqis hard in 06 and 07 on self-reliance. We backed off the pedal a little bit in mid-07 because we wanted to lower the level of violence. So what happened in that time? Well, one of the things that happened was the awakening, the Anbar awakening, and bringing the tribes in. This is a challenge for the government of Iraq. It's a challenge politically, and when the thing goes off, we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's also a challenge structurally. One of the things that we want to do is tie those tribes to the central government to build some relationship. And that relationship isn't just political. At the end of the day, it's fiscal. Who's paying their salaries? If the U.S. government is paying their salaries over the long run, then they're loyal to the U.S. government as long as they're paying their salaries. We want to build a relationship between those tribes with the central government. Eventually, we want to demobilize them as warfighters and bring some portion of them into the system. Now, the other piece of this assimilation versus dependency is that we realized after Secretary Gates came in, I think the decision was made that the Iraqi security forces was too small. We had designed a security force that was designed towards that diminishing level of violence and not versus the reality on the ground. So the growth of that force has naturally slowed the movement to self-reliance. If you've already built your force and it's complete, then you can do all those ministerial things to make them more effective over time and make them self-reliant. If you're still growing the force, there's a limited amount of dollars out there, and your money's going towards growth and not towards efficiency. So I think we're just about at the point where the forces in Iraq are not going to get much larger once we figure out what portion are going to join the security forces from the tribes. And then it's really, at that point, it's going to be how effective are this government of Iraq in maintaining that capability, and then how effective are they in giving options to the rest of those people with arms.